Всем доброе утро.
Good morning, everybody, dear friends.
Рад, что вы решили узнать чуть больше о кибервойне.
I'm glad that you decided to learn a little bit more about cyber war during this beautiful Sunday day. My name is Oleg Shakirov,
Презентация посвящена
and this presentation is dedicated to the topic of cyber wars. We're going to speak
что конкретно делают
not
конкретные группировки.
about what specifically done by some specific groups. We are going to speak about this phenomenon. Why is it so difficult to determine it? How does it look like in reality? And how countries are trying unsuccessfully to solve this problem.
Кратко обо мне.
Briefly about me, my background in international relations, I've been studying external politics, regional problems, traditional security problems, and then I got involved in IT security, and sometime I've been involved in this problem. And honestly speaking, on the connection of these problems, states try to understand what is to be done, because it cannot be solved just by technical measures, the informational security. When the politics comes there, when the military services comes there, it becomes into military, political, geopolitical, militarized.
Поехали.
Let's move on. Number one, and the most important, what we are going to begin with. What is a cyber war and how it is being determined? Well, it's not a simple question. Yesterday we had several events that I visited in the world. Cyber war has been used several times on several occasions, very freely. Yes, there is a cyber war. Cyber wars will happen. And on one side, I do understand when people say that in the verbal conversation without specification. But if we will look from the political point of view, there will be a lot of questions. Okay, let's go back to 1987. Back then,
вернулись в 87 год снова.
Back to 1987. In 1987, Yuri Baturin, well-known cosmonaut, when he wasn't a cosmonaut, he was a lawyer, he was studying computer law, and he published a book, Law and Politics in Computer Circles. It was an overview book, but it has a full article about computer wars. And he's looking at this problem from under the point of view which is not common today. He speaks that computers can be hacked, they're hacked in banks, but they can also be hacked in military systems, which can lead to military conflict. Some people can remember a movie that was filmed in 1980s, Military Games. Maybe you've heard about movies like that or books like that a little bit later, that hackers are breaking computer and global war begins. The most popular metaphor is Terminator when they speak about AI and cyber weapons. So this idea is very popular in sci-fi, but people started thinking about it both on the level of the state. Why states are thinking about it? Because in 1980s, computers started being implemented everywhere. Star Wars program started with Ronald Reagan, and I think as a counter-propaganda, Soviet Union started promoting the idea that computers are not as safe, and maybe we shouldn't develop Star Wars and we shouldn't get involved in computerization, but as a general path for disarmament and arms control, we can get rid of this. And in this context, we see the topic about the computer wars. But this is a very viable topic. And right now, in some state strategies, we can see the echoes of this global catastrophic cyber war, where due to errors and due to target hacking, nuclear conflict can begin. For example, in recent 5 to 6 years, Russia, US, UK, they have changed their nuclear doctrines, and they have had a reflection of this fear in these doctrines. For example, in the Russian document, which is called the Foundation of the State Policy in the Area of Nuclear Resistance, they've listed in the Article 19 conditions of applications of nuclear weapon, and one of these conditions is related to intervention into the activity of the the systems which obstruct the reverse nuclear impact activity. But everybody started thinking about it. One of the probable interventions can be by breaking computer network. US has a more direct statement here. During Trump, they had debates, but the idea was that they need to determine can we reply to the nuclear attack with nuclear weapons, to computer attack with nuclear weapons. But people discuss it. Okay, let's move into the future. 24 years in the future. In 21, there was a project working on the general terminology. It was Critical Terminology Foundations. And the Institute of Problems of Informational Security of Moscow State University has been working together with American non-commercial organization East-West Institute. They also are rooted in the Cold War, and they've been involved in building the scientific expert connections between East and West, between socialistic and capitalistic blocks. And experts from the US, from Europe, they gathered together and decided to create common terms to understand of what is really happening in the cyberspace, how can we work with it. The idea of this definition came immediately because diplomats and officials from the US and states have been speaking different languages. In our sphere, this is a common knowledge that Russia promotes on the international levels information security term, which is more covering United States, even though inside of the country they use information security and other terms, but on the international level they speak about cyber security. So Russian experts and United States experts decided to work on this general definition, and they have listed different definitions in this dictionary. And there's a cyber war definition. You can read it. This is something more specific, but not specific. So this is some attack against critical systems. There are critical systems that are being attacked. More specifically, something more serious, but it's not clear what they're speaking about. We can hear the terms of cyber war from the politicians, and this exists everywhere. For example, in the year 22, in the March 22, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia have published an announcement about continuous cyber aggression from the side of collective West. While the Ministry of External Affairs doesn't use the word cyber, and they are against this statement, the term aggression is not just a word, it has a certain sound in international law, and it shouldn't be used like that, but Ministry of Internal Affairs have published it. Then there was an announcement of Vladimir Putin during the meeting of the Security Council and other announcements. So if you look at it, the cyber war is happening. It's not determined to the end, but it happens, and maybe it never stopped, and it is continued with participation of not only states, but some other groups as well. There's a concept that cyber war never happened and will never happen, and this is a book which is more than 10 years old. Thomas Reed looked at all this discussion that was developed in 2010, and he said that this is, of course, very interesting, but all these cyber attacks, they are not on the level of cyber war. He has several criteria. He looks at the definition of Clausewitz about the war, but two criteria by which he doesn't pull up cyber attacks, don't pull up to any level of war. First of all, the level of violence, and there's not a lot of violence in cyber field. And the second one is political moment. Many attacks that we look as attacks, they do have a political foundation. They are politically motivated. At the same time, there's a big difference between them and between how the states are holding these wars. Many cyber attacks, including when they're being organized by the states, they are not published. They are hidden. They hide their participation, the states. And this is the main difference. So cyber wars or cyber attacks, they play some other role than a war by itself. And Thomas Reed has three traditional types of activities which are more described than a cyber attack, political cyber attacks: espionage, sabotage,
ну, или диверсионной деятельности, если больше
and
нравится.
diversion
И
activities,
тут он говорит,
diversion
да, если мы так
activities.
определяем,
And
если мы
if
говорим,
and
что
he
кибервойны не
says
будет, такой полноценной, когда, как
there
в
will be
фильмах,
no such
как
a
вот вспомните,
war
Юрий
like in
Батурин
the
говорил, что
books.
с
For
помощью
example, like
взлома у
Yuri
нас
Baturin was
начинается
saying that by hacking,
ядерный конфликт. Такой
nuclear
кибервойны не
conflict
будет,
can begin.
но у
Well,
нас
this
есть
cyber war will not happen,
деятельность, которая может
but we have
сопровождать любой
activity
военный конфликт.
that can
Я
go
думаю, что это
after any
довольно
military conflict.
хорошее замечание, потому что у нас в действительности
It's a
так и
good.
происходит. Но давайте еще более конкретно посмотрим. Есть
But
сферы,
let's
где
look more
определение
specifically. There
кибервойны,
are
оно имеет очень
specifics where
конкретное
the word
назначение.
definition
И
has a very
это, прежде всего,
specific definition.
страхование.
First of all,
Возможно,
insurance.
многие из вас слышали
Perhaps many
про
of you
кейс
already heard
компании
about a
Merck.
case
Компания Merck
from
была
Merck
одной
Company.
из
The
тех,
Merck
кто
Company
пострадал
was one of those
в
companies that
2017
suffered
году
in the year
от заражения
2017
NotPetya.
from
И
not petty
Merck
infection.
решил обратиться к своим
And
страховщикам,
Merck
чтобы
decided to go to
получить
their insurance companies
выплату по
to
страховому
receive
полису.
insurance
Причем это крупная
payment.
компания, поэтому у нее
And
несколько
it was a big
страховщиков.
company. That's why it
И
had several
страховщики в какой-то
insurance
момент
policies. And
решили, а
insurance
почему мы вообще
companies, at
должны
one moment
платить?
of time, they decided, why should we pay?
NotPetya в
Not
какой-то
Petya.
в 2019 году, если я не ошибаюсь,
In
США выпустили
2019,
официальное заявление,
US
что
have published
NotPetya,
official
они
announcement that
атрибутировали
NotPetya
эту атаку
has attributed this
российской
attack
военной разведке.
to Russian
И тут
military
для
intelligence.
страховщиков
And for the
возникает
insurance
очень
companies,
привлекательная
they have
ситуация.
a
Если
very
это военная
attractive
разведка
situation.
какой-то
If this is a
страны,
military
то это уже
intelligence of a
подпадает под
certain country,
исключение
then
о
this is
военных
under the
действиях.
exception of
И они подают
military
в суд, они говорят,
actions.
мы не будем платить,
And they
потому
go
что
to court and they say, we are not
исключение.
going to
Это
pay
становится
because this
большой
is an
новостью, все
exception.
начинают
This
это
becomes a
обсуждать.
big news. Everybody
Но
starts
в Мерк
discussing it.
тоже журналисты
But
недаром денег
Merck
едят, они идут
journalists, they
и
also
начинают оспаривать это
paid
решение.
good
И вот
money
в
and they
начале
start going against
24
this
года или
decision. And
в
in
конце
the beginning of the year
23 года
23,
суд
beginning of
США решил в
24,
пользу
the
Мерк.
United States court decided
Почему суд
for
решил в пользу
Merck.
Мерк? Ну, там
Why
довольно
the court
все,
decided
как вы
for
понимаете,
the
сложно
Merck
эти
company?
документы.
Well, everything is very
Но
complicated,
базовая
all
идея
these
такая,
documents, but the
что
basic idea was that
форс-мажорные обстоятельства
force majeure
наступают в
circumstances
случае,
are
когда мы
happening
говорим
in
о каком-то
cases
конкретном
when we speak about any
традиционном конфликте,
specific
ну, по крайней мере, как это
traditional
тогда было
conflict,
написано.
or as
То
it
есть
was
это
written back
конвенциональный
then.
конфликт,
So this is
из-за которого
conventional
действительно,
conflict, after
который
which
нельзя предусмотреть, который действительно
which
является
cannot be
форс-мажором.
predicted and which
В
is a
общем, Мерк
force majeure
выиграл, он должен
conflict.
получить
So
свои
Merck
выплаты.
has won and they
Но
will
страховые
receive their
компании, для
insurance
них это дело
payments.
не
But insurance
заканчивается,
companies,
и
well, they don't
они
stop on
продолжают эту
this and they
работу,
continue
определять,
this
что же
work
является кибервойной,
by
потому что
defining what
киберстрахование
is a
активно
cyber war
развивается.
because cyber
Многие
insurance is
организации покупают
developing. Many
полисы,
organizations are buying
и
policies.
страховщикам нужно как-то определиться,
And
когда им
insurance
нужно
companies,
платить.
they have to determine when they
Поэтому,
should pay and where they shouldn't
каждая
pay.
компания делает
That's
по-своему, но
why
вот на
every
слайде
company
пример
does it in their own way. But on the
про
slide, you
компанию
can see an
Lloyds.
example about
Они опубликовали
Lloyd
такой документ,
company. They've published a
в котором
document
говорят, какие
where
минимальные
they are saying
условия
what
должны для
minimal
исключения должно
conditions
содержать
should
страховой полис, который
contain
именно рассчитан на
insurance
киберстрахование.
policy
Ну и вот выделили два
dedicated for
момента,
cyber
собственно, на
insurance.
слайде.
And
То
there are
есть,
two
во-первых, он
topics
должен
on
в
the
целом
slide.
содержать
First of all, it has
исключения на
to
случай войны.
contain
Но это если мы
exceptions for
представляем
the
такую
case of
традиционную
war.
войну,
But
когда
if we perceive a
нету
traditional
каких-то
war where there
разных
are
мнений
no
относительно того,
different opinions
исключение это или нет.
about whether it's
Но
exception
если
or
это не
not.
традиционная
However,
неконвенциональная война,
if
то
this
в
is
каком случае тогда можно делать
non-conventional
такое
war,
исключение?
in
И
which
вот они
case this
предлагают, что,
exception can be
во-первых,
done. So they
это должна быть
propose that,
такая
first of
как бы
all,
деятельность, такая
this
кибератака,
is some
деятельность
kind of cyber
государств,
attack
которая
or
приводит к
activity
нарушению
of the states which
функционирования
leads to
государства.
the
Ну, видимо, где
reduction of
находится
functionality of the state
организация,
where
которая
the
застраховалась.
organization is located, which has
И
been
еще один
insured.
момент, что нужно четко прописать в этом
Also, you have to
страховом
clearly
полисе, как
define
будет
in this
проводиться
insurance
атрибуция.
policy how the
И вопрос
attribution is going to
атрибуции,
be
он
done.
здесь всегда
And the
встречается, потому что если
attribution
мы
question
говорим
is
не
always met
о
because if we're not
киберпреступности, не
speaking
о как
about
бы
cyber
АИБ как о бизнесе,
crime,
тогда, ну, в
but
принципе, не
about
так
as a
важно, кто
business,
атакует,
and
главное
it's not
защититься,
as important
то
who is
здесь
attacking,
мы
but
упираемся
we
в
have to
политические
defend ourselves.
вопросы,
So
и
we
кто
see
же атакует,
political
это
questions
супер
involved.
важно. Ну и вот для
And who it
страховщиков
is,
тоже очень
this is
важно.
also super
В
important.
общем,
It's
такой
very important for insurance
интересный
companies.
как бы,
So
подход,
it's a
активно развивается сфера.
very
Причем
interesting
она для России тоже довольно
approach.
актуальна. Я
And
выступал
this is
в
a very
первый день
important approach for Russia.
конференции
Well, I've been
на
speaking during the first
тему
day of the
утечек данных
conference on the topic of
и
data
штрафов за
leakages
утечки данных. В
and
России, если кто не
penalties for
знает, за
data
последние 2
leakages in Russia.
года
In the
значительно
course of
увеличилось
last
количество
2
административных
years,
дел по
we
утечкам
see
данных,
more
утечкам
civil
персональных
cases
данных, когда
for the
штрафуют
data leakage
организации,
when
которые по мнению
organizations are
Роскомнадзора
being
не обеспечили
punished, which
достаточную защиту
according to
персональных данных.
Roskomnadzor did not
Вот, и
protect
если,
the
допустим,
personal
наступает
data
такой случай, у
sufficiently.
компании есть страховой полис,
And the company might have the insurance policy in most of the cases. attackers or those who are thought to be attackers are hacker groups which are located outside of Russian Federation, and this can be a company that can go to the insurance company and can say, okay, you will pay us at least the amount of penalty and reaction to the incident. And the insurance company will say, well, we will make an exception because this is some kind of act of war. And then there will be a similar situation. I haven't seen in Russia any cases like that, but in the West it's been shown much often because Merck is a Western company. Another one where the cyber war implicitly happens in criminal cases, as it might seem. Cyber war happens, well, this is my observation, you can argue, it's as a in the criminal cases, there are 3 criminal cases that were looked in the Rostovsky region.
За неправомерное воздействие на критическую информационную инфраструктуру.
Illegal activity against critical infrastructure, and 3 people have been.
Судя по этому, они все занимались примерно одним.
All these people have been done the same thing, and the sentence, well, in February, March 22, some Ukrainian groups have been proposing to get connected to collective DDoS attacks, and they've been proposing to get connected them even to those who have no skills for it. You just had to open a link in the browser, and the user machine became one of the sources of this attack. It's a very not advanced attack. And in the sentence from one of the cases, we've been speaking about this attack. So all these sentenced people, they've received real penalties and time in prison. Well, this is cyber attack against critical infrastructure, nothing surprising. But the thing is that if you will look at law enforcement practice in Russia for DDoS attacks, usually people don't go to prison, and they are just in the materials of this criminal case. It doesn't say that participation in conflict was aggravating circumstance.
Сроки, которые получили эти приговоренные, они
the terms in prisons, they are much higher than in other situations. And this is where cyber war can be met.
Ну, и, может быть, нам поможет определиться с тем, что такое кибервойна.
And perhaps we'll get more determined about cyber war through some stories, some prioritization. When the first cyber war happened, maybe you know already. I've tried to figure out this situation. Some people say that the Ukrainian conflict is the first full-scale cyber war. You can read it in foreign media. Ukrainian officials speak about it. But if you will Google a little bit more than 1 minute, you can find something that this is not the first cyber war when it happened. For example, in the Western academic and political spheres, the popular version was the DDoS attacks against Estonia in 2007 spring, were the first call that woken up Estonia, NATO, and have shown them a real threat of cyber war. But this also cannot be called the first cyber war. We can go a little bit more back, and let's go to 2001, where when not far away from China, there was an incident when Chinese and American airplanes impacted. Well, this is not a cyber incident, but what happened afterwards, it was really impressive because Chinese hacker groups and American hacker groups started attacking each other, and it was the first hacker war that happened. There are even earlier examples, like a Second Chechen War, when Chechen separatists had their own sites which DDoSed Russian sites. And Chechen hackers and those who've been on their side, they've DDoSed and defaced Russian sites, and vice versa. There was an interesting example of Kosovo crisis and NATO interference. What was so interesting about this example is that it is well known from documents that the US have been actively discussing possibility of using some cyber possibilities during this conflict, but as a result, they did not do that. However, at that moment of time, there was a lot of hacker groups, and when US, together with their allies, interfered into this conflict, Serbian, Russian, Latin American hackers started fighting against NATO in these primitive methods like DFS and DDoS, and it was shared in mass media as one of the first cyber wars. Well, we can go even further away. A book about Chinese hackers. It's a conflict about anti-Chinese actions in Indonesia when Chinese hackers started attacking Indonesian sites. Why I'm showing this? I like what gallant were cyber wars of those days. If you look at the bottom part of this post deface, it's information for administrator. We didn't want to damage you, we just broke it. If you will remove this file, then you will fix it and the site will come back online.
Вот, ну давайте поговорим о сегодняшних киберконфликтах.
Well, let's speak about current cyber conflicts and cyber wars and their participants. And let's summarize. What about definition? Definition is very diluted. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Nobody can completely define what is a cyber war. That's why it's so general. There's a lot of problems about it. But it's a reality. There is no single understanding in the states, and even separate states evolve in their understanding of cyber war. Nobody will answer you what is cyber warfare. So who participates in cyber warfares? We can divide participants into state and non-state participants, and they are different by their approaches. State participants, they have big money, big budgets, and we will look at several services involved in this, and you will be able to evaluate the scale. Also, they have resources for their own development of cyber possibilities and certain tools, or for purchasing of commercial products for this purpose. What differentiates real state actors from non-state actors is availability of doctrine, because usually state hacker groups are based on the Ministry of Defense, of Secret Services. These are military organizations. They should have a doctrine, what they do, what they don't do, what is their functionality. Also, states, especially big states, they are not perceiving cyberstate as some exotic environment. Very often in the Western world, it's called the fifth domain, and the best minds are working on how to integrate activities in the cyberspace with other political, diplomatic, and any other activities. For non-state actors, it's much more difficult because they are not so often involved in it. Another interesting topic that I was speaking about, state actors are almost never boast of their cyber attacks. They are usually acting in hiding. And we have very few examples when the state was taking responsibility for some cyber attack. Because, well, you see some examples here on this slide. The well-known example is the only cyber attack for which the United States took responsibility. The campaign against IGIL, when the US in 2016-17 were fighting against IGIL in Syria and Iraq, they've been conducting a cyber operation, and part of it was a glowing symphony, and it was a very complicated operation, which is not very well known, but it has included decommissioning of the propaganda machine of the IGIL and violating their communications, so that they would complicate their reaction to a land-based and air-based operation of the US and their allies. Another interesting example, not really confirmed one, but it was as some kind of a data leak from the cyber management year 2019 to the Washington Post, have told us that during the intermediate elections in 2018, the cyber team has conducted certain operation against Riafan, against media empire of Evgeny Prigozhin. And this was done with the purpose so that trolls shouldn't interfere in American elections. And this has been confirmed by Riafan, but we have no technical proofs. We have the word Riafan, cyber control, but what is interesting in this is that after a certain period of time, journalists have asked Donald Trump, who was the president president back then, did he give permission for this campaign? He said, yes, I've sanctioned this cyber operation. So this cyber operation was not the most serious one, but this is the first case when the head of the state does admit that he did give order to his cyber department to do cyber operation against media organization in another country. Very interesting case. And during final several months, since November of the last year, the main intelligence department in Ukraine, nobody understands why, but they started taking responsibility for cyber attacks against targets in Russia. Previously, they have not been involved, but since November last year, more than a dozen of cyber attacks already happened, which was attributed to GUR. Some of these attacks look like they really happened like that. Some of them look like exaggeration, but it's an interesting phenomenon because it never happened, and we don't know why they decided to do that. And there are some coquettish, some semi-admissions. Some of you know Stuxnet, and no conference on information security shouldn't happen without Stuxnet being mentioned. But Stuxnet is not confirmed officially, but disclosure of some information about operation that is called Stuxnet. They've had a criminal case against one American general. Then Obama have released him. It was an almost direct admission. And the same thing is done by Israel. For example, there is a group, activist group, but it considers that it supports Israel. Predatory Sparrow. It exclusively attacks Iran. And after one big attack, it was as if Israeli media have announced that the head of department that is involved in attacks has congratulated their colleagues with successful attack. And then he was speaking against mass media that they've been writing about it. So it was kind of a spectacle that was in front of our eyes. Let's speak about non-state groups. They're less organized, much less organized, but they're more motivated. That's why they can organize very fast. Plus, we do see that expertise overflows from cybercriminal world to political world. We also see that these groups don't feel ashamed to say that they participate in the cyber wars. So if the state is not participating in the cyber war, they do nothing, they silent, they sit on their hands. And in cyber criminal groups, they announce the war. And Russian group, I don't know, Russian pro-Russian group Killnet, in the spring 22, has published an announcement that we start a cyber war against 10 countries. And they've conducted DDoS attacks against them. But what is interesting is that their motivation is very high on the side of those groups. They use any available means very often, publicly accessible, sometimes commercially, sometimes modified. They can also use means from the cyber world. At the conference, they had presentations from some groups which started using leaked code Lockbit to conduct political attacks, non-financially motivated ones. Doctrines for those organizations, they have habits, experience, and some experiments. If something works, the organization will continue doing that. If the news have published information about this organization will be happy, and it will continue striking in the same point with the same means against other organizations. They like to announce about themselves, and this is where the complexity is, because these organizations, they like to exaggerate their achievements, and they love to say that they've done more than the states. They like to take responsibility for attacks which possibly have been done by state hackers. And honestly, they are very noisy, and there is a version that state specifically helps and supports and closes eyes to the activities of these groups to create this smoke screen behind which they can do real things.
Ну, и они, естественно, могут иметь связи
And
с
of course, they might
госорганами.
have
Мы сейчас
connections
чуть-чуть
to state
поговорим о
bodies
том,
of
какого
authority,
рода
and
это
we're
могут
going to
быть
speak about
связи.
what kind of connections these could be.
Но прежде чем мы перейдем к
But
негосударственным актам,
before
давайте
we will
кратко
go
поговорим
to
про
non-state
военные,
actors,
кибервоенные
let's
организации,
speak
какие они
about
вообще
military and
есть.
cyber war
Не про
organizations.
все
What are
поговорим, не
those?
все
Let's
организации
not speak
одинаково
about all of them
публичны,
because not
поговорим только про
all of these
некоторые.
organizations are
Прежде всего
public.
про
Let's speak
США.
about several of them, for example,
Американское
about United States.
киберкомандование уже существует больше
American
10 лет,
cyber management
и
exists
это
more than 10
самая такая
years.
давняя организация,
And
которая
this
именно
is the oldest
организована как
organization that was
военное
organized as a
киберподразделение. То есть оно
military
тоже выросло, оно
cyber
имело
division. It
корни в
also had
киберподразделениях
roots
ВВС,
in
но
cyber
как
departments of
самостоятельная
the
структура она
Air
появилась в
Force.
2009 году, и только к
It was created in
середине
2009, and by the
2010-х
middle
обрело
of
как бы полноценный вес.
2010,
При Трампе оно было выделено в
during Trump,
самостоятельное
it was separated as a
командование,
separate,
Unified Command.
as
При
unified
этом, в отличие,
command.
допустим, от Великобритании,
But compared to the
Великобритании
United
это называется
Kingdom,
National Cyber Force.
in
В
UK,
США
it's called National
киберкомандование не
Cyber Force.
является как
In
бы
US, Cyber
видом вооруженных
Command
сил.
is not a
То есть
type
все
of
виды
military
вооруженных сил —
force. So
это
all types of
армия,
military forces is the
флот,
Army,
военно-морские силы,
Fleet,
ВВС и морская
Air Force,
охрана. Они все имеют свои
and
киберподразделения, и киберкомандование, оно
they have their
скорее
own
является
cyber
координирующей структурой,
departments,
которая
and
развивает
this
эту
cyber
экспертизу.
command is a
Но США тоже
coordinating
обсуждают
infrastructure which develops this
создание вот таких
expertise.
киберсил.
And they're discussing creating these
В чем особенность
cyber
США? Это
forces.
довольно
What is the peculiarity of the US? It's a very publicly discussed this cyber strategy and doctrine are, and when this cyber command was created, it was created as a reaction to the cyber incident that Americans has connected to Russia, infection of the internal Pentagon network. But this has determined that the cyber command was focused more on defense of networks, of Pentagon, defending United States in case if some critical attack will happen that will stop the critical infrastructure operations, etc. A little bit later, and until today, the cyber command target has shifted to more proactive in the United States. It's called the concept persistent engagement. Persistent engagement. The idea here is very simple. American strategies, they're formulated like that our enemies working against us without weekends continuously, persistently. So we also should work against them persistently. And we should do it not only in our networks, but also in their networks. And as a result, it's a very controversial doctrine because it justifies proactive defense, which is cross-sected and overlaid over the attacking operations. Another important moment about US and UK is that both of these cyber forces are organized on a connection of military department and intelligence. It's like A and B in United Kingdom in GCHQ. It's understandable that expertise in the area of radiotechnical intelligence traditionally was A and B in GCHQ, and it was tools because cyber divisions, they need them for some military operations. Okay, let's look at a couple of European countries. For example, France. In France, cyber divisions and cyber force is called Force of Cyber Defense. It was created in 2017. It was also announced by the United States, but there is a number of differences. First of all, it is based exclusively on military foundation, and it's not under the head of the NB, not to the head of the intelligence, but to the general headquarters. Also, the cyber department of France has an interesting peculiarity as that in their mandate they also have conducting informational operations, informational influence, informational psychological. Well, the American cyber force does it as well too, but publicly they don't speak about it, and maybe some other departments in the US doing that. Also, you can look at Poland. In Poland, a little bit later, the cyber force has been created, and it copies the American model. It is called
Силы защиты киберпространства.
the skills in protecting cyberspace. They also are based on the Ministry of Defense, but they are, if you look at the organization, they copy American experience. They collect expertise from all types of forces, and including in the end of the last year, it was announced that together with Americans, Polish forces, cyber forces, participated in some offensive operations against some 5 groups. Well, we can only guess against whom, but it was very interesting because I assumed that until a certain moment of time, these forces will be involved only in defense because they have things to defend. And well, let's not speak about Europe. We have an example with the best logo. It's the Service on Digital Questions and Intelligence of Singapore. It was created in the year 2022. And what is interesting, you can see a very interesting dynamics of cyber military race that you see in the political sphere and in the cyber sphere as well. When the Ministry of Defense in the Parliament has justified his decision to create this cyber division, he was referring to conflicts which were happening globally, and he was also speaking about, okay, let's look at the cyber conflict in the Ukraine. We also need to have a separate 4th type of military force because it's a separate tier of military actions, and we have to work in this direction. Okay, let's get closer to us. In our region, we don't speak about it openly, but there are some interesting expressions of cyber militarization that is happening. For example, with great interest, I've been reading military doctrine of Belarus that was published officially in April. And they have a point about applying military force during the wartime, during peaceful time. And there is a paragraph which says that to prevent informational technical influence leading to sustainable operation of infrastructure of the state, forceful and non-forceful character and regulating questions of informational security. So if you take away everything external, well, the Belarus will use forces against some cyber attacks. Nobody understands which cyber attack, but well, here it is. In Russia, they've been discussing creation of some analogy of cyber command under the influence of the United States. Since the year 2017, nobody speaks about it, especially after the scandal with the interference into the American voting. Nobody speaks about it. So officially, it's not understandable. What is the status? But on the conceptual level, we do have evolution, interesting evolution. And last year, a concept of the external policy was published, more diplomatic document by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And there's a paragraph which says that in case of unfriendly actions with the use of ICT, Russia has the right to use symmetrical or asymmetrical measures. So if you take away every extra, Russia does allow usage of ICT against ICT, cyber attack against cyber attack. What does it mean? Well, it's not specified, but it's not a military document, it's external political document. Okay, let's speak briefly about relations between states and hackers. Sometimes they call them hacktivists and state hackers, but there's an interesting book by Tim Moore, American researcher. It's interesting about cyber. He speaks about several options of relations about a state between state and hacker groups, and this is classification of state with those proxy mercenaries. He separates 3 groups. The first one is delegation, which means that the state cognitively delegates to some non-state actors conducting or participation in these cyber activities. And as an example, he makes the United States compared to some other researchers. He speaks about contractors as private players who act in the framework of legislation. The second option is coordination, orchestration, in other words, when the state is freely allows the activities of activist groups for their own needs, but in general coordinates it. As an example, book 2000, Iran and Syria were put as an example. And option number 3, it's totally free flight. It's so-called allowance. And as an example, he was making post-Soviet environment, and specifically Ukraine and Russia. He was studying condition of cyber conflict after year 2014, and he was saying that there's a lot of similarities, both like Russian and Ukrainian government perceives hacker groups which are acting against external players from the territories of these countries, allegedly, as if from territories of these countries. So there is a classification like this. It's not perfect classification. You cannot say that it's specific for every country. For example, we have a recent example of leakage as if from West Chinese contractor which provides hacker services to different departments, called ISUN. And perhaps from this classification, it would go into delegation because this contractor plays some objectives for the government. But if you will read correspondence that was happening between them, you will see that compared to American contractors, this Chinese contractor doesn't feel himself that confidently. They act more like as a startup or semi-legal structure. In other words, it's not under delegation, but this is a little bit more than just coordination. Or another RC Army of Ukraine. If you will look at classification by Team Moore in Ukraine, there was an allowing approach. But if you will, at the IT Army of Ukraine, this is not the most Ukraine, but it was organized with the call. It was organized by the Prime Minister of Ukraine, and there's a research which assumes that coordination is done by the military forces of Ukraine, and the composition is voluntarily basis, mercenaries. So structures can be different, complicated. They can overcross in the frame of one country. They can have different character. Let's speak about consequences of this cyber war. There's exaggerated opinion that cyber warfare should be or shouldn't be allowed because this will lead to cyber conflict, and there's a totally contradictory statement that wars were always happening, but these hacking adds a little piece to all of it. Maybe it's like that, changing nothing fundamentally, but we have a good example, Iran-Oman conflict. I would like to remind you, in the year 2014, Albania have accepted, how can we call it? Not guests, but have received a group that organized a camp called as Unity of Iranian Group. This is a group that was fleeing from Iran after Islamic Revolution and fights against Islamic regime. It was considered as terroristic in the United States and EU, but they did decide to change it, and they found a place to place this organization on the territory of Albania. And they continue their activities against Iran, and in the year 2022, somebody has conducted big cyber attacks against Albania, and state services in Albania didn't work for several weeks. After that, a number of reports have been published, after which it came that behind these attacks there were Iranian organizations. And this has been escalated to such a level that Albania, that would never be able to determine the source and wouldn't react to this so sharply, but they made a decision to stop diplomatic relations with Iran and received support from NATO, rhetorical support. So we can see here that cyber attacks lead to some disconnections of important services. They have political consequences as stopping diplomatic relations, and potentially they can have other consequences, but these consequences often are not happening.
Пробежимся по непосредственным и длительным эффектам кибервойны.
Okay, let's speak about long-term effects of the cyber war. It's interesting to speak about long-term effects of cyber war. First of all, it facilitates cyber conflict no matter who does it, state or non-state structures. It facilitates the proliferation of the expertise, proliferation of tools which are used by everybody. And this is a chrestomatic example. Vulnerability Eternal Blue, which is, as it is being considered, was long time used by A and B. After this, it was leaked, and then it was used by everybody else from pro-state all the way to independent groups. The same thing happens when the cyber war happens. Nobody reacts to it, nobody can limit it. We see some normalization of criminality and even change of the group profiles in both directions. Some criminal groups, they can feel hype and they can go into political sphere. Some groups which have appeared as political groups, for example, Anonymous Sudan, they have recently launched a service for DDoS by rent. So you can pay money, and the group which position themselves as political will provide this service to you. Same thing happens as a fragmentation of digital environment, because nobody trusts anybody, because everybody wants to develop their own sovereign internet. And for development of the rules that we're going to discuss right now, consequences are not really obvious. We don't actually know whether the world is going to wake up as after Carib crisis with the idea that we have to stop it, or the cyber war will be on this level below the war threshold, and we will never be able to normally regulate it. Okay, let's omit the section about the international law, even though it's interesting, it's boring. In here, I'm looking at what changes we have in Belarusian cyber doctrine. Military doctrine in Belarus says that Belarus can react forcefully to some cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, but what kind of cyber attacks, it's not clear. For example, several days after publication of this military doctrine, hacker group Cyber Partisans, which consists of Belarusians, has conducted and published data leak. It is obvious that KGB of Belarus can be considered as critical infrastructure, but this is also obvious that it's not a foundation for some forceful response. We also don't know what legislation, if there is legislation, has to be developed against whom these attacks should be, if they are going to be trans-border and the hacker groups are not in Belarus. What will it mean to international law? All these things create a lot of questions, and these are not purely abstract questions. Okay, let's look at ways how the states tried to limit the cyber warfare. In 1991, well-known Yuri Baturin publishes another book where he publishes a project of intergovernmental agreement between USSR and United States about mutual computer security. And this is a very interesting agreement. It's super non-realistic. But what is interesting that even back then they've been offering, this is one of the earliest attempts to regulate this problem. There were different bilateral consultations when American and Russian experts have been meeting and they've tried to agree. And they came to the conclusion that we can agree only about norms of behavior, not some kind of control of cyber forces, but norms of behavior. And one of the participants of these negotiations writes about it, but he said there was no conclusion out of it. We have cyber norms in UN, and I can tell you about this a little bit later. But the problem with these norms, they've been working on them in the course of many years. They exist, but they are voluntarily and non-mandatory, so everybody execute them as they want. Some of these norms have legal characters, but there is no single opinion about them amongst countries. There is also trust measures. These are measures which work during the peaceful times, but in the conflict, they don't work. For example, between Russia and the United States, there is a hot cyber hotline. Analogy of the hotline that was created for nuclear topics after the Caribbean crisis. Will it develop? No, I don't know. Not clear. There was also an idea to create
По мотивам соглашения о предотвращении
On the
инцидентов на
motives
море.
of this agreement,
ушло
cyber
никуда,
incidents
хотя
on
идея
the sea,
интересная.
it didn't go anywhere,
Ну,
but
есть
it was an
инициативы
interesting
Красного
idea.
Креста, например,
There's
Красный
also
Крест
Red Cross initiatives. For
предлагает
example, Red Cross
продвигать
proposes
международное гуманитарное право
to
и
promote
помещать все
international
организации, которые
humanitarian
должны
law,
пользоваться
and those
защитой по
organizations
международному
which have to
гуманитарному
be
праву с
using
специальной киберемблемой.
protection,
То есть,
they
условно
should
говоря,
have
больницы
special
должны на
cyber
своем сайте
emblem.
разместить
Hospitals on
киберемблему,
their site, they
и есть
should
разные
have
варианты,
the
как это
cyber
сделать, и
emblem.
хакеры не будут их
There is an
атаковать.
option how to do it, and
Реалистично
hackers will not attack them.
ведутся споры,
Realistically,
пока мы не
well,
видели,
they're
чтобы это
arguing about
чтобы
it,
это
but we
применялось.
didn't see
Также
for
Красный
this to
Крест
be applied.
опубликовал правила
Also,
для
Red
хакеров.
Cross
Они тоже вытекают из
published rules
международного
for
гуманитарного
hackers. They
права.
also come from the
Ну, это как
international
бы правила
humanitarian law,
добровольные,
but these are
обращенные к
voluntarily
активистским группам.
laws
Если вы хотите быть
directed to
хорошими
activist
гражданами,
groups. If you
подумайте
want to be
о
good
других.
citizens, please think about
Ну и
others.
сейчас еще тоже более противоречивая вещь
And right
обсуждается.
now,
Это
even more
расследование кибервоенных
contradictory thing,
преступлений.
cyber
Прокурор
military
Международного уголовного
crimes.
суда, он говорит, что
International
некоторые
Court
преступления, хотя в Римском статуте нет оснований для этого, он
prosecutor.
говорит,
Well,
что
in Roman
некоторые
statute, they don't
преступления,
have
они
foundation
тянут
of
на
it,
то, чтобы
but some crimes, they
расследоваться как
can
военные
be
преступления.
investigated as military
Неизвестно, как
crimes.
далеко это зайдет, но
Nobody
есть
knows how far
определенная
it will go,
инициатива, есть
but there are
поддержка
certain
Microsoft этого
initiatives,
процесса,
and there's a
и,
support
возможно, мы увидим об
of
этом
this
чуть
process by
позже.
Microsoft, and we'll see a little bit
Ну
more
и
information about that
завершая,
later. And in
может
the
быть,
end of my
последний
presentation,
слайд.
maybe my final slide,
Активистское перемирие существует или нет? Мы знаем, как
activist
минимум один
truce,
пример
does it
такого
exist or no?
перемирия.
We do know
В
about such a
2020 году
truce. In the
был
year
конфликт между
2020, there was a
непальскими
conflict
и
between
индийскими хакерами, и
Nepalese
в итоге
and
индийские
Indian
хакеры
hackers,
по
and
DDoS
Indian
и
hackers, after the DDoS and after
сайты
defacing
непальцев, они сказали,
sites
мы с
from
нашими
Nepal,
братьями
they said,
договорились,
okay, we have agreed
прекращаем
with our
огонь,
brothers,
мы
let's
одной
stop
крови.
warfare, we are of the
Спасибо.
same blood. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Отвечу на пару вопросов от аудитории. Не схожа ли кибервойна с прокси-войнами?
Does the cyber war looks like proxy wars? Yes, it does look similar, and very often these organizations on which states relied or maybe who act, they are proxy players, states are hiding behind them and indirectly are not acting. And this complicates the definition of cyber war, definitions of thresholds of cyber wars and limitation of cyber wars. Complicating cases were during peaceful time if the cyber attack was defined for espionage, for example. Possibly, yes. The idea that cyber conflict is aggravating circumstance in the conditions of the conflict, yes, this is my hypothesis. This has to be checked on the biggest amounts of data. We don't have such a sample. Chechen hacker is strong. They've been afraid by ANB. What's so cool about them? I wouldn't say that they are specifically cool. The thing is that back then, internet was well proliferated, so that one could create visual damage, even though this damage was not too visual. So every time when in the end of 90s, beginning of 2000s, some politically motivated incidents were happening, it was in the news. What's known about cyber war forces of China or India? A lot of things are known, but only from the reports of cyber companies. These companies are not telling about themselves in great details, and we have an asymmetry that United States tells everything about themselves, not everything, but a lot of things, and other countries are not speaking a lot about it. And US, we judge from what they tell about themselves, and about other countries, what US also tells about them. About the China, we have a wide chain, they have a wide chain of activists and different other departments which are involved in some attacks. And honestly, I was really surprised when during another conference in the autumn of this year, the Solar has announced that Chinese hacker groups are the main threat against Russian organizations. So they were not speaking about military, but about industry, espionage. But what is very interesting that China works very widely and has resources for this. Thank you very much.
Если нужно выбрать лучший вопрос, то я считаю, что вот вопрос про тягчайшие обстоятельства
I think that the question about the
пытается разобраться с проблемой.
Aggravating circumstances is the most interesting one. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to wish you good completion of the conference. Thank you very much.